Thank you. You've had an extraordinarily successful legal career. You didn't have to take this job. And you stepped forward and answered the call yet again, knowing full well that you would be subject to the kind of slanderous treatment, the Kavanaugh treatment, that we have seen of senators impugning your integrity. And I, for one, am grateful that you answered that call and are leading the Department of Justice both with integrity and fidelity to law. That is what the nation rightly expects of our Attorney General, and I believe you are performing that very ably. I think this hearing today has been quite revealing to anyone watching it, although perhaps not for the reasons some of the Democratic senators intended. One thing that's revealing in the discussion and questions that came up, a word that occurred almost none at all, is the word Russia. For 2.5 years, we heard Democratic senators going on and on and on about Russia collusion. We heard journalists going on and on and on about Russia collusion, alleging, among other things, some using extreme rhetoric, calling the president a traitor. We heard very little of that in this hearing today. Instead, the principal attack that Democratic senators have marshaled upon you concerns this March 27th letter from Robert Mueller. And it's an attack that I want people to understand just how revealing it is. If this is their whole argument, they ain't got nothing. So their argument is as follows, and let me see if I understand it correctly. You initially, when you received the Mueller report, released to Congress and the public a 4-page summary of the conclusions. Then on March 27th, Mr. Mueller asked you to release an additional 19 pages, the introduction and summary that he had drafted. And indeed, in the letter, what he says is, quote, I am requesting that you provide these materials to Congress and authorize their public release at this time. And the reason he says it is that to fully capture the context, nature, and substance of the office's work and conclusion. So you did not release those 19 pages at that time. Instead, a couple of weeks later, you released 448 pages, the entire report, which includes those 19 pages. Do I have that timeline correct?
That's right.
So their entire argument is, General Barr, you suppressed the 19 pages that are entirely public, that we have, that we can read, that they know every word of it. And their complaint is it was delayed a few weeks. And that was because of your decision not to release the report piecemeal, but rather to release those 19 pages along with the entire 448 pages produced by the special counsel.
Yes.
If that is their argument, I have to say that is an exceptionally weak argument. Because if you're hiding something, I'll tell you right now, General Barr, you're doing a very lousy job of hiding it. Because the thing that they're suggesting you hid, you released to Congress and the American people. And so if anyone wants to know what's in those 19 pages that are being so breathlessly, oh, Bob Mueller said release the 19 pages. You did. You did it a couple of weeks later. But we can read every word of the 19 pages along with the full report. In your judgment, was the Mueller report thorough?
Yes.
Did they expend enormous time, energy, and resources investigating and producing that report?
Yes.
And the Mueller report concluded flat out on the question of Russian collusion, the evidence did not support criminal charges.
That's right.
And indeed, the Mueller report, if I have these stats right, was compiled by 19 lawyers who were on the team, approximately 40 FBI agents, intelligence analysts, forensic accountants, and professional staff. The special counsel issued more than 2,800 subpoenas, nearly 500 search warrants, more than 230 orders for communication records, almost 50 orders authorizing the use of pen registers, 13 requests to foreign government for evidence, and interviewed approximately 500 witnesses. Is that correct?
That's right.
So we have investigated over and over and over again, and the substance of the accusations that have been leveled at the president for 2.5 years have magically disappeared. Instead, the complaint is the 19 pages that we can all read that is entirely public, could have been released a few weeks earlier. Oh, the calamity. Let me shift to a different topic, a topic that has been addressed already quite a bit. I believe the Department of Justice under the Obama administration was profoundly politicized and was weaponized to go after political opponents of the president. If that is the case, would you agree that politicizing the Department of Justice and weaponizing it to go after your political opponents is an abuse of power?
I think it's an abuse of power regardless of who does it.
Of course.
Yeah.
To the best of your knowledge, when did surveillance of the Trump campaign begin?
The position today appears to be that it began in July, but I do not know the answer to the question.
It is an unusual thing, is it not, for the Department of Justice to be investigating a candidate for president, particularly a candidate from the opposing party of the party in power?
Yes.
Do we know if the Obama administration investigated any other candidates running for president?
I don't know.
Do we know if they wiretapped any other?
I guess they were investigating Hillary Clinton for the email.
Do we know if there were wiretaps?
I don't know.
Do we know if there were efforts to send investigators in wearing a wire?
I don't know.
So, General Barr, I would urge, you have had remarkable transparency. You promised this committee you would with regard to the Mueller report. You promised this committee and the American people you would release the Mueller report publicly. You have released the report. Anyone can read it. It's right here. I appreciate that transparency. I would ask you to bring the same transparency to this line of questioning about whether and the extent to which the previous administration politicized the Department of Justice, targeted their political rivals, and used law enforcement and intelligence assets to surveil them improperly.
This committee is engaged in an investigation that will allow us to determine whether to recommend articles of impeachment with respect to President Trump. That is what we are doing. Some call this process an impeachment inquiry. Some call it an impeachment investigation. There is no legal difference between these terms, and I no longer care to argue about the nomenclature. But let me clear up any remaining doubt. The conduct under investigation poses a threat to our democracy. We have an obligation to respond to this threat, and we are doing so. Under the procedures outlined in this resolution, we will hold hearings that allow us to further consider the evidence against the president. At those hearings, in addition to member questioning, we will allow staff counsel to participate for 1 hour per witness, evenly divided between the majority and the minority. This will allow us to develop the record in ways that the 5-minute rule does not always permit. We will also allow the president to respond to the evidence in writing and on the record. No matter how we may disagree with him, President Trump is entitled to respond to the evidence in this way. And we will treat certain sensitive evidence, such as grand jury information, as being received in executive session. Under these procedures, when we have finished these hearings and considered as much evidence as we are able to gather, we will then decide whether to refer articles of impeachment to the House floor. We have a constitutional, historical, and moral obligation to fully investigate these matters and to make that decision. Let us take the next step in that work without delay. I urge my colleagues to adopt this resolution, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You say that Google takes its content moderation responsibilities very seriously. That's your testimony here today. Is that fair to say? You strive to be even-handed and neutral.
Yes, we construct our algorithms to be politically neutral.
Analytically objective and apolitical, I think, were your exact words.
Exactly.
Is that
yes.
right? And you don't impose filters based on political viewpoints. That's your testimony.
That's correct.
And despite the fact that almost exclusively your executives, employees donate to one political party. I think 1% of the donations that came from Google in 2016 went to Republicans or Donald Trump. All the rest went to the other party, Hillary Clinton, the Democrats. It is your testimony that you never use content moderation to advance an ideological agenda. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator, and it's, you know, it is both contrary to our mission, contrary to our business interest, and it would be incompatible with the systems that we build to work political bias in there, which I think is why we've had third-party studies, including the ones that I referenced, that demonstrate that we do not have political bias in
and
our
inconsistent
products.
with your basic values, I imagine you would say.
Inconsistent with our values.
Except for when you do it in China, right?
You're
happy to censor for the repressive authoritarian Chinese regime, like, for instance, with Google.cn, happy to censor away any mention of Tiananmen Square, happy to help the Chinese government maintain control of all information within the country, happy to help them control the information flow to their own citizens. You're happy to do all of that. Would you call that censorship with an ideological agenda?
Senator, we don't offer almost any of our products in China. We don't offer Google search.
Wait. Are you saying that Google CN did not include censorship tools based on what the Chinese regime asked for? Is that your testimony?
Google.
Just reminds you you're under oath now.
We have not.
Google CN did not include censorship material?
Senator, I don't know what you're
not familiar with Google CN?
I'm referencing the fact that we exited China in 2010, and we did so because Google, at that point, in addition to being under attack, we felt that the censorship requirements that were being applied to Google were not compatible with the products that we were able to.
But you did offer Google CN. You developed it, and it included censorship tools that would have screened out things like mentions of Tiananmen Square. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, Senator. Are you referring to Project Dragonfly?
Oh, well, I wasn't, but
okay,
because that's a separate thing. But
yeah,
since you mentioned Project Dragonfly, why don't you tell us about it? Is it active right now?
It's not, Senator.
You're able to say that for the record. It's not active. You've abandoned Project Dragonfly?
Yes, we've terminated that.
Are you willing to commit today here that Google will not agree to or participate in any form of censorship with the Chinese regime in China against Chinese citizens? Or will you commit to that? You will not agree to any information or restrictions on data flow in China, the Chinese market?
Senator, I'm trying to imagine hypothetically what you're referencing. We don't
Google
provide search.
CN, for instance.
We don't reference China's search in China. Fundamentally, in China, we actually do very little today, certainly compared to any other major technology company. We really...
So you won't block search terms for Uyghurs in concentration camps or Tiananmen Square? You won't do that in any business, any venture going forward?
We don't...
No, I'm asking you won't, because we know you have in the past. That's what Google CN was. You know you've contemplated it with Project Dragonfly. I'm asking you now for a commitment. I'm glad to hear you say that Project Dragonfly has been canceled. I think that's news. So that's good to hear, because there's been news reports that it's still active. So I'm delighted to hear that.
We've been clear that we have no current plans to go into China in the search market.
That's great. So that's great. And you're committing to me here today that you will not in the future do so, and you will not engage in censorship in China.
What we're willing to commit to, Senator, is that any decision to ever look at going back into the China search market is one that we would take only in consultation with key stakeholders.
Yeah, that's what you said in response to Senator Blumenthal's questions about whether or not you submit to an audit. It was the longest no in the English language. Now you're not giving me a yes or a no. Let me just come back to a question that Senator Blumenthal asked I thought was interesting. You're confident that Google hasn't been infiltrated by Chinese intelligence?
We see no evidence of that, Senator.
What do you think about General Dunford, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, his comment at the Atlantic Council a few months ago that typically, I'm quoting him, typically if a company does business in China, they're automatically going to be required to have a cell of the Communist Party in that company, and that is going to lead to the intellectual property from that company finding its way to the Chinese military. Do you think he's right about that, wrong about that?
Senator, we do, as I mentioned before, barely any business in China, so I don't have really the basis.
Past, and you have tried to.
2010, we exited the country.
That wasn't that long ago.
10 years ago.
Okay. Well, my point is this. You've been more than willing to engage in ideological censorship in the largest market in the world. You have been more than happy to partner with the most repressive authoritarian regime on the planet, all for profits, whatever it is that is good for Google. Why would anybody believe you now when you say you won't submit to a third-party audit? You just answered Senator Blumenthal no to that. You won't commit to me that you won't engage in censorship when it suits your purposes in China and the Chinese market, for instance, in the future. Why would anybody believe you now when you say we don't ever impose an ideological agenda? What assurances can you give us?
Senator, I think what I can tell you is that in China today, we don't offer any of the products that you're referencing that would...
No, I mean here. What assurance? Why would we believe you now when you say in the United States or anywhere that you do business